So there are a variety of glands that are associated with the integumentary system. And in this lecture segment, that's going to be our focal point. So in general, all glands are derived from epithelial tissue. And it turns out that the basic anatomy of the gland is that the deepest part of the gland, which is referred to as the secretory epithelium, is part of the gland, or is the part of the gland that produces the substance or the secretion that the gland will then release. There is a tube, which is usually referred to as the duct, that connects the secretory epithelium to the epithelial tissue that the gland is going to be secreting its substance onto, which is the surface of the body or inside of a body cavity. The duct may be straight or it may be coiled as well. So this is a simplified diagram here, but it shows you the basic structure of most exocrine glands here. Endocrine glands look a little bit different in that endocrine glands, they have a secretory portion, or they have a secretory part of the gland itself. But instead of having a duct, the secretory part of the gland is usually associated with a blood vessel. So for that reason, endocrine glands are usually referred to as ductless glands because they lack a duct to the surface or to a body cavity. So that being said, glands can either be classified as exocrine glands or endocrine glands, and exocrine glands are the types of glands that we're going to be taking a look at in the integumentary system right now. And exocrine glands release their substances onto the surface of the body or into a body cavity. Whereas endocrine glands, as I mentioned, are ductless glands, and they're usually closely associated with blood vessels. And so they generally release their secretions, which are referred to as hormones, into the blood, which is passing through the gland by the blood vessels that are associated with that particular endocrine gland. So let's turn our attention back to the integumentary glands. So we're going to look at three specific glands of the integumentary system. We have the eccrine sweat glands and we have the apocrine sweat glands. So we're going to look at two varieties of sweat glands. And then we're going to look at a sebaceous gland. So let's start with the eccrine sweat glands. Now, the eccrine sweat glands are the most numerous of the two varieties of sweat glands. Their function is to produce sweat or perspiration, which is going to act to cool our body by evaporative cooling, and therefore it's going to prevent overheating of our body. So it's one mechanism by which our body serves to get rid of excess body heat. They have ducts because they are exocrine glands, and their ducts empty directly onto the surface of the skin. And so generally the secretory part of the gland is coiled and kind of twisted around itself in nature, and then it has a single duct that extends to the surface of the skin. And so that duct is through which sweat will be released onto the surface of the skin. These two images here show cross-sections through the secretory portion of the eccrine sweat glands. So in these images, the coiled part of the gland actually looks like little rings that are parallel to one another, simply because we've taken a small thin slice through that gland, and we're only looking at a small part of the coiled secretory part of the epithelium there. So for that reason, they look like small rings that are in close association with one another. And the ducts are actually quite noticeable as well because the ducts are generally a stratified cuboidal epithelium. So you have two or more layers of cube-shaped cells that line the duct of that particular gland there. All right, so eccrine sweat glands, where are they found and what are they producing when they're producing that sweat that cools our body? So eccrine sweat glands are fairly abundant on just about every part of the skin's surface. In particular, there's a high abundance of them on the forehead, the palms of the hands, and the soles of the feet. The sweat that they produce and release contains mostly water. So as you can see, about 99% of sweat is water, and it contains trace amounts of these other substances as well. So it contains trace amounts of sodium chloride salts, and so this is what makes sweat salty. It also contains trace amounts of nitrogen wastes that's Most of these nitrogen wastes are typically removed or excreted from the body through the urinary system. So you can see we have urea, uric acid, and ammonia. So most of these nitrogen wastes are eliminated from the body by the kidneys, by the urinary and renal systems. But because a small amount of them is present in the blood, it does get secreted through the sweat glands and onto the surface of the skin as well, in very, very small amounts. The sweat also contains an antimicrobial peptide because, of course, on our warm bodies, the moisture from our skin and sweat could promote bacterial growth. And so for that reason, sweat contains an antimicrobial peptide, which is basically just a small antimicrobial protein. And this antimicrobial protein or peptide is called dermcidin. And so it helps to reduce and slow the growth of bacteria on the surface of the skin, particularly in that warm and moist environment that we usually see when there's excessive amounts of sweat on the body. Those are kind of ideal conditions for bacterial growth. Sweat also generally has a low or acidic pH, so anything lower than a pH of 7 on the pH scale is considered acidic. And again, this also helps to slow down the growth of bacteria on the surface of our skin. Generally, the pH of our skin is anywhere between a pH of 4 and a pH of 6, so it's fairly mildly acidic. A pH of 4, because it's lower than a pH of 6, is actually fairly acidic, and this kind of varies from person to person here. So those are our eccrine sweat glands. Let's turn our attention to our apocrine sweat glands. The apocrine sweat glands are less numerous than the eccrine sweat glands, so these are a little bit more rare type of sweat gland in the body. In total, there's only about 2,000 apocrine sweat glands in your body, and they're generally confined to the axilla, so that is the underarms, and the anogenital region, so that is the region that's near the anus and the external genitalia. So apocrine sweat glands have a pretty similar structure to our eccrine sweat glands in that it's a coiled secretory portion with a single duct that extends toward the surface of the skin. But in this case, the ducts of apocrine sweat glands actually empty into hair follicles. So these glands are always associated with body hairs, whereas our eccrine sweat glands, their ducts are not associated with body hairs. So the sweat that the apocrine sweat glands produce not only contains sweat, but it also contains a mixture of both fatty acids and proteins. And so bacteria on our skin will actually use these fatty acids and use these proteins as a source of fuel. And in the process of using those as a fuel, they generate metabolic wastes. The bacteria do. The bacteria generate metabolic wastes, and that metabolic waste contributes to body odor. These glands are not functional at birth. Instead, they actually become active during puberty, and then from puberty onward, they are active. So they become functional at and during puberty. While their exact function is not yet known, they are thought to act as sexual scent glands because the amount of sweat that these glands release actually increases during sexual foreplay and sex. So we've seen our two varieties of sweat glands. Let's now turn our attention to the sebaceous glands. So finally, with the sebaceous glands, we see that these glands are also associated with our body hairs, and so they can be seen in this diagram here as these little bulbs that are branching or extending off of the hair follicle, kind of in fairly close proximity to the epidermis. So these glands, just like the apocrine sweat glands, are associated with our body hairs. And their ducts empty into the hair follicles, just as the apocrine sweat glands do. Sebaceous glands are found in basically all locations on the body that contain body hair or where body hair is found. They do not secrete sweat, but instead they secrete an oily lipid-filled substance or lipid-containing substance that's called sebum, and so that's where they get their name sebaceous glands from, is because they're producing and secreting sebum. Because these glands are associated with hairs, the contraction of the erector pili muscles, which cause our body hairs to stand on end when we're cold or when we're frightened, the contraction of these erector pili muscles also causes sebum to be squeezed out of these glands and onto the surface of the skin or into the follicle of that hair. Now, sebum actually functions to soften the hair in the skin, which is going to prevent the hair and skin from becoming brittle. It's also going to prevent it from cracking. And it also functions to make the skin water resistant, because remember, water is going to have a hard time evaporating through a lipid interface. And so if there is lipids, or if there are lipids that are coating the surface of our skin, it's going to help prevent rapid water loss from across the surface of our skin. Now, one thing that I'll point out here as we wrap up our discussion on the glands here is that acne is an inflammation of active sebaceous glands, and that inflammation is caused by a bacterial infection. And since sebaceous glands become essentially kind of active at puberty, and generally that's when they're quite highly active, infections by the bacteria that cause this inflammation of the sebaceous glands are fairly common. And these infections and inflammation can range from anywhere from very mild to extremely severe, enough to the point that it could cause permanent scarring on the surface of the skin.